I want to go to Genesis chapter 16. Let's go to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16. And we're going to read starting at verse 1. Genesis chapter 16, we're going to start at verse 1. All right. Now, Sarah, or Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant." So essentially what she's saying is she couldn't have children, and so let's try to have children through the servant. All right. So she told her husband to go sleep with the servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abraham agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abraham, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abram replied, "Look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. All right. I want to talk about the power of resentment today in marriage. The power of resentment. Resentment is plaguing a lot of marriages. Resentment is secretly festering in a lot of marriages. Just by a show of hands or yes or no in the comments, if you've ever felt resentment in your marriage. All right. Yes, yes. All right. All right. So let's talk about this. What is resentment? Resentment at the core of the concept is unresolved emotional debt or pain or frustration. So resentment is what happens when someone hurts you, offends you, disappoints you, whether it's on purpose or not on purpose. But they don't try to fix it, or they don't fix it, or they aren't able to fix it. And then they keep on living as if you're okay or you're fine. So this is the heart of resentment. So it forms when hurt is experienced, disappointment, pain, frustration, letdowns, etc. But it continues to form deeper when it's not processed or when it's not repaired. All right. So from a psychological standpoint, resentment is suppressed anger mixed with disappointment. And the reason anger typically is what is festering is because all of the other emotions seem weak. And we don't want to look weak or feel weak or seem weak. So we don't allow those other expressions to be shown. We would rather show anger, even if it's passive aggressive animosity. So from a biblical standpoint, resentment is when you are offended and that offense has never been given or received any type of forgiveness, right? And you haven't released it to God. So in marriage, resentment happens for a lot of people because of big events, because of mediocre events, and because of small events. But more importantly, resentment tends to fester and resentment tends to grow because it was never actually dealt with. So, and the Bible talks about how in Hebrews chapter 12, it talks about how any root of bitterness can spring up from trouble, right? When something is troubling you and you don't deal with it, you don't address it, or if it doesn't get resolved. So, for example, some people might address it, but it doesn't get resolved. So then resentment tends to build up or creep in, right? And that's bitterness forms because forgiveness was never given, and then resentment tends to take place. And so resentment is not resentment is not you displaying anger because of the issue. Resentment is you storing the feelings and never having them resolved, right? So I want to walk through the progression of this. Number one, resentment is formed because of expectation. So the first step in this is you have an expectation. Whether it's communicated or not, there's an expectation you have. And if that expectation is not met, right, this is how resentment begins to form. So in marriage, as you all know, expectations are constant. Like we all have ongoing expectations. We all have ongoing expectations. So because we all have ongoing expectations, it's almost like a never-ending cycle. You know what I'm saying? So in marriage, it's almost like I expect you to understand me. I expect you to prioritize me. I expect you to change. I expect you to help. I expect you to protect, lead, nurture. I expect you to whatever it may be. I expect you to be faithful. I expect you to be trustworthy. I expect you to keep your word. I expect you to be loving and caring. But the progression of resentment is when that expectation is violated, right? So when the expectation is violated by disappointment or neglect or anything of that nature, what tends to happen is that spouse might not know that they dropped the ball on your expectation, or even if they do know they dropped the ball on your expectation, what happens is if that spouse doesn't respond in a way that is fitting to you, resentment starts to set in. Especially if that behavior or the letdowns or the disappointments become repetitive. And this creates emotional injury. It creates psychological pain. It creates mental anguish. It creates emotional harm to the point where you feel like this person is doing this intentionally, even if you can rationalize that they're not. It doesn't change what it feels like. And then what happens is next is if that pain or that hurt or that disappointment or that letdown is not expressed, if it's not expressed or if it's not communicated or if it's not talked about or if it's not dealt with, right? This is the turning point. So instead of having honest conversations to where you can share your heart, share your thoughts, share your feelings, and be vulnerable and communicate and try to repair the issue and put the issue on the table, if a person chooses to avoid it or ignore it, or if a person tries to deal with it, but it's not to your liking or it's not to your satisfaction, right? it still can allow resentment to creep in because you're not getting the resolve that you desire. So then that pain, that hurt, that disappointment, that letdown, it turns into anger. Even though there's other emotions behind it, the frustration, the sadness, the emptiness, the rejection, the neglect, all these different feelings you may have, right? These emotions you might feel are there, but it turns into anger or aggression or anything that um could how I want to say it. I'll just stick with anger. Yeah. Anything that could be powerful, a powerful emotion that makes you feel powerful. And so from there, the culture shifts inside the marriage, right? The culture shifts inside the marriage. And when the culture shifts inside the marriage and that resentment gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, that resentment starts to come out in various ways. So what ends up happening is now as a spouse, you're no longer seen as a spouse or a partner or a teammate or an ally. You're seen as a problem, a burden, a disappointment, an issue, a weight. Are y'all with me? Is this making sense to everybody? I know it's kind of quiet right now. I know because I'm laying out the foundation. But is this resonating with everybody? Okay. All right. Because resentment is a powerful, powerful, powerful thing. And it lives in marriage. And it lives in marriage for years. Because we're not getting the emotional resolve that we desire. So the question becomes, what's really happening on the inside of us? What's really happening on the inside of us? When resentment forms, a person is thinking, even if it's unconsciously, a person is thinking, you hurt me. You disappointed me. You let me down. And you don't care enough to fix it? You gonna leave me to feel this way by myself? Cool. Now I gotta protect myself. So this is where that ideology in that subconscious mind comes into where it's like, you're my enemy. You're not my spouse anymore. I got to protect myself from you. This is the power of resentment. It changes your viewpoint of your spouse. It changes the viewpoint of your spouse in such a way that you begin to see them not as your spouse anymore, but as your enemy. And most resentful people aren't just mad. They're trying to self-protect. And when you self-protect, that turns you bitter. Because your focus becomes about protecting yourself, but you never actually resolve the issue. So most resentful people are not mad, they're disappointed, and that disappointment feels weak. So instead of looking weak and telling you I'm disappointed, because I've already mentioned it probably, I'm not going to keep looking soft and weak and da, 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 da. So now I'm going to just get angry. I'm going to get passive aggressive. I'm going to start checking you. I'm going to start making this, like that's how we handle and approach it, even if it's subconsciously. So your disappointment becomes your own type of armor that protects you. Even though you're not protecting yourself, you think you are, but you're not. And so now the spouse is trying to figure out why they don't do this no more. Why don't you do that no more? Why we don't talk no more? Why you standoffish? Why you always mad? Why you always angry? Why you always frustrated? Like now you start to recognize that these are kind of like signs that there's resentment because the issue was never resolved. The issue was never dealt with. Is this making sense so far? Any questions so far? All right. So when resentment shows up in your marriage, your communication becomes very transactional. Instead of trying to understand each other, it becomes, I'm only talking to you because I have to. Your conversation is no longer warm. Your conversation is no longer inviting. Also, your intimacy declines because that resentment blocks your intimacy. And this is why, for a lot of marriages, women tend to carry more resentment because typically in marriage, the average couple, for a man, the issues, the things that he's lacking tends to be due to the fact of how the wife is feeling resentment. It doesn't mean men don't. It just means that from a dynamic standpoint, oftentimes you see a woman carrying more resentment, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We're not going to get into that today. But that intimacy declines because that emotional safety is gone. That trust is gone. The vulnerability feels stupid. Why am I going to feel, why am I going to be vulnerable to my enemy? Even though you're still my spouse, you're my enemy. Because when you hurt me, disappointed me, let me down, you had no desire. It feels, keyword feels, like you had no desire to fix it or correct it or change it or improve it. Let me throw this nugget in here. The dynamic of marriage is this for us in 2026. The dynamic between men and women. Men are looking to women to help them be more at rest. Women are looking to men to fix a lot. And this power dynamic, this struggle is very prominent in marriage. It's very prominent in marriage. A man is always expected to fix something. A woman is always expected to bring lightness to something. This dynamic creates resentment on both sides. So number 3, your roles in marriage becomes weaponized. Your roles in marriage becomes weaponized. So because of the resentment, you start to feel like, you know what? You ain't a good leader in the first place. Or you so disrespectful. You don't submit anyway. And so now you both start to feel overburdened, underappreciated. And now you start to defend your spousal territory. You start to hold your ground as a husband, as a wife. And now the resentment is eroding the marriage like a disease. Because unresolved emotional issues and conflicts have never been settled. You understand what I'm saying? So at that point, guess what happens? Forgiveness stops flowing. Because resentment has convinced your heart that they don't care. So they don't deserve forgiveness. They don't care about how I feel, so I'm not doing this. They don't care about me, so I'm not going out of my way. And then you start to have that ideology where they should know better. They should already know who I am. They should know how I feel. They should know. They should. Right? And so resentment is very common in marriage because of the proximity between husband and wife. And when that proximity keeps getting violations of emotional and mental capacities, mental and emotional nature, and you don't repair it, the marriage places, think about it this way, in marriage you have two flawed people coming into proximity together to live every single day together. with an expectation that you're going to make me happy, fulfill my desires, be there for me, do this for me, do that for me, yada 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 yada. And so these small offenses that start happening, they start to stack up, and that emotional fatigue starts to build. And now your grace and your mercy and your love starts to dry up. And now resentment has taken a hold of your entire marriage. Resentment, let me just deal with it from a psychological standpoint. Um, in your brain or your mind, when an expectation is violated by someone who deeply matters to you, in this case, it's your spouse, the context of that violation seems very costly because this is your marriage, this is your spouse. And so this is not a stranger. You don't feel resentment towards strangers because you don't have an expectation from them. So when it's your marriage, your brain is saying, your mind is saying, this person was supposed to ... fill in the blank, protect me, support me, cater to me, listen to me, prioritize me, whatever. You just fill in the blank, understand me. And they didn't do it. And when that hurt and disappointment and pain sets in and it never gets resolved, that's where the resentment in your brain starts to form. And then it goes throughout your nervous system and you start to live it out in action because your body can't ignore what's happening. But here's the thing about resentment. Resentment doesn't go away on its own. Oftentimes, it actually strengthens your memory. Because listen, when you try to suppress resentment, it actually makes your memory stronger. All right, I'll skip that part. So the thing is, when we go now, I want to tie in the scripture we read about Sarah and Abraham and Hagar. The Bible says, which we read already, that Sarah, she didn't have any children. Abraham didn't have any children, right? Um, but in this dynamic, it's a crazy dynamic because here is Abraham and Sarah wanting to have a child. They didn't have a child, and so Sarah comes up with this idea to give her servant to her husband. And here is Abraham who rolls with the idea, and now Hagar gets pregnant, right? And so Hagar then begins to treat Sarah differently. Now, can y'all obviously see where the resentment starts creeping in, obviously, throughout this situation? Can y'all see how resentment will kick in? Right? It's a dynamic to where Sarah is very disappointed. Sarah is because I can imagine what she thought would happen. Her expectation was Hagar will have a child, treat me good, still see me as her, her authority, and give me the baby and still serve me, right? But you can imagine for Hagar, it's kind of like, well, hey, I'm able to do something you can't do. So you know that dynamic between women. You know how that go. So verse 5 Sarah goes, Abraham, this is all your fault. What? All, all my fault, right? That statement reveals everything. So the question is, was that resentment? Of course it was. Of course it was. Because the expectation was violated. And then anger was stored, right? Sarah expected Abraham to emotionally protect her, more than likely. She expected Hagar to remain submissive, more than likely. And she expected that this idea would solve a problem, not create more problems. But the decision was mutual, but the emotional cost fell on Sarah much more. Y'all can see that, right? Because as a woman, she might have felt less than, she might have felt, unworthy. Like it could have been a lot of different things, right? And then here you have Abraham, bless his heart. He's just trying to figure it out. Um, and he says, well, listen, this is your servant, deal with her as you see fit. And so Sarah, she, treated Hagar harshly and ran her away. And so this the violation of their relationship, I'm pretty sure Sarah felt despised, right? Her status as a wife felt threatened. Um, her barrenness became louder, right? Um, I guess, feeling like I couldn't do this became more front and center in her face. It's like, but the displacement of the blame is more of the topic of conversation right now. Because psychologically, Sarah initially she initiated the plan, right? So her coming up with the idea, but still displacing the blame on Abraham is a clear sign of resentment. Sarah couldn't emotionally handle the outcomes and consequences that she couldn't really have fathomed to happen, to be fair. But the point is, it's still resentment. It's still resentment. What made it even worse, what made it even worse, what happened in terms of this whole dynamic, right? And the resentment was being mad at Abraham wasn't going to fulfill anything, not in totality. So she had to kind of take it out on Hagar because she couldn't fully resolve her resentment with Abraham. Because what's Abraham going to do at this point? He can't put the baby back in her, right? So now the emotions are being directed different places. And this is what you call textbook classic resentment. Now, the Bible doesn't really show us, but we can all assume that there was some tension those 9 months that the baby was being formed in the womb. We can almost assuredly know that there was tension after the baby was born. We know, and the Bible doesn't give us all those details, but we can assume and make very good conclusion, right? That that there was a lot of emotional tug of wars. What is the point of all of this? When you don't deal with resentment properly, your marriage is going to suffer. But it's not just suffering in a magnified way. You ever heard the term death by 1,000 cuts? Have you ever heard of that phrase? Have y'all heard that? Death by 1,000 cuts. Nobody wants to die like that. But this is what resentment is. Your marriage will die by 1,000 cuts because when resentment is in place, everything in your marriage feels like a cut. Everything being said, everything being done, everything how it looks, and the tone, and the language, and the body language, and the expression, and the decisions, everything is just. And when it's unrepaired, it destroys your marriage. Unmet expectation, emotional injury, mental anguish, pain, frustration, leading to behavioral expression, whether it's harshness, cold shoulders, stonewalling, criticism, hatred, anger, frustration, snappiness, attitude. All of that is resentment showing up. What are y'all thoughts on this?